Sega. Sorry, let's try that one more time.
Sega!
When you see Sonic the Hedgehog and Mario getting together for yet another Olympic game, it's easy to forget the past. Basically, it's like Goku and Vegeta spotting each other in the gym after previously blowing holes in one another. At one time, Sega and Nintendo built entire marketing campaigns around insulting and destroying one another. It was the video game equivalent of WWF and WCW, though with mercifully 100% less Disco Inferno. These were the companies that ultimately battled for video game home console supremacy from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, with Sega at one point leading Nintendo in sales with the iconic Sega Genesis. But what about the rest of Sega's consoles? Well, Sega's story as a home console manufacturer is a bit of a mixed bag, to put it lightly. Beyond the Genesis, every system they made either struggled to find a sustaining audience, which isn't necessarily indicative of how good the system itself was, or failed critically and commercially in one fell swoop. The story of Sega can be a sad one at times, especially when some of their consoles were just one breakout game away from success. But this is also a company responsible for several excellent game systems. Barring excellence, some of their efforts were at least ambitious and interesting, if not just outright seriously weird, and we're all about the weird here. Others are infamous failures that were rightfully scorned and ignored in their time. They almost did too much, releasing just too many confusing, unwanted editions like the Sega CD and 32X as a result of being stuck between generations. Ask your parents if they remember trying to find a 32X for you for Christmas one year, and they will probably keel over from stress and memories of Golf Magazine 36 Great Halls starring Fred Couples. The story of Sega is a wild one worth celebrating from top to bottom, or in this case, from worst to best, with this look that ranks every single Sega console from worst to best. Just a note that due to the relatively few consoles Sega released, as well as the opportunity to try and figure out what they were thinking with the 32X, we will be including add-ons this time around. But before then, we have a Steam key to give away to one random viewer. To take part, all you have to do is subscribe, and be sure to comment 27k gang down below, and we'll draw a winner next week. Right then, it's time to go moderately fast. Number 9, SG-1000, SC-3000, SG-1002. It looks like we're talking about 3 different consoles here, or at least some long forgotten Stargate spin-offs, but really the SG-1000, SC-3000 and SG-1002 all refer to the same system pretty much. Sega's first foray into the world of home consoles is easily their worst effort, which is, fair enough. The company not only had to contend with the rising juggernaut known as Nintendo, but also their own inexperience and a video game industry that, in the late 1980s, was at best struggling pretty hard. Nothing was going to work out for the SG-1000 or any of its variations. Largely forgotten to time, the Sega SG-1000 was interestingly enough released on July 15th, 1983. Those who know their video game history will know that was also the day Nintendo released the Famicom. While Nintendo's first serious effort at a home console would eventually spread worldwide, the SG-1000 stayed primarily in Japan and Taiwan, with systems also released in Australia and New Zealand. Not surprisingly, the system didn't do well. It's worth mentioning that early Sega mascot franchise Wonder Boy made an appearance here, as well as titles like Girl's Garden, Bomb Jack and Flicky. We will never truly know how close we came to Flicky and Mario at the Olympics 2012. What could have been? Sega would also release the SC-3000, which was basically the SG-1000 transformed into a computer, and eventually the SG-1002, an update to the SG-1000 that really didn't go anywhere either. Despite the failure of the SG-1000 range, Sega decided to stay in the console market, which worked out pretty well for everyone in the end. Number 8. Sega Pico. The edutainment console Pico on paper and in terms of specs wasn't a bad console by any means really. In fact, the console was very well received in its native country of Japan. The unit sold millions and some 400 games were made for the console. There's even a successor exclusive to Japan called the Advanced Pico Bina, which sounds like a forgotten Dragon Ball Z boss. Then the system was released in North America, generating a meager few hundred thousand in sales before disappearing quietly. A number of titles were launched in the West, but we're ultimately talking about a range of games made specifically for very small children, and maybe Forrest Gump. That fact alone, coupled with the Pico's failure in North America, keeps this system down near the bottom of any Sega console ranking. The only reason why it outranks the SG-1000 is because an argument could be made that the Sega Pico was technically more successful in what it set out to do, even if virtually no one outside of Japan ever played the thing. There's not much to really recommend here with the Sega Pico and its place among every Sega console. There's not really much to say either. It's basically like critiquing the Leapfrog tablets for young kids. However, if you're a die-hard retro Sega collector, you'll be pleased to find that the system and many of its games are pretty cheap, and you might even learn something in the process. Maybe old dogs can learn new tricks. Number 7, the 32X. Nothing on this list has the infamy of Sega's baffling, comically short-sighted, and kind of pretty arrogant 32X. Functioning as an add-on that would be attached to your Sega Genesis, the 32X was in a vacuum designed to carry Genesis players along to the thrilling upcoming world of 32-bit gaming. The add-on saw some pretty good titles released during its very short lifespan, including Star Wars Arcade, Metalhead, and Mortal Kombat 2. That's all well and fine, but the problem with that was Sega also releasing its real 32-bit console, the Sega Saturn, in the same year. Sega even decided it would be wise to release the 32X just 1 month after the Saturn in Japan. In the US, the 32X had 5 months to exist on its own before it would be effectively replaced by the Saturn's US release. That's as stupid as Pluto not being a planet anymore, it's still real to us, god damn it. The 32X in of itself wasn't a bad idea, released to good reviews in November 1994, but some of its developers wondered the point of making games for it when Sega was just going to throw everything behind the Saturn in a few months anyway. They were right to avoid making games for the 32X, and those who did, more often than not, barely made an effort to take advantage of what the attachment could genuinely do. The system sold poorly, given what it promised, saw only 40 games ever released with many more cancelled, and was being sold for $19.95 by the middle of 1995. Somewhat predictably, some games for the 32X now sell for 32 times what they're worth because only 32 people bought them. Number 6. Game Gear. The Sega Game Gear came to us in 1990 and wasn't perfect by any means. While its handheld rival, the Game Boy, had issues like no backlight and a more primitive display, at least its sprites were a little more defined. You could, however, watch TV on the Game Gear if you bought a special tuner, which, checkmate? The Game Gear was also a fiend for batteries, with the Matrix's People Farms rumoured to be inspired by the system's unquenchable thirst for energy, but it did benefit greatly from at least 2 essential features. It offered players a chance to enjoy their favourite Sega games on the go, and it all came in brilliant colour. Sega emphasised this during the deeply entertaining, existentially terrifying era in which the company and Nintendo would lob vicious insults at one another with surrealist nightmare TV commercials. The 90s were a weird, beautiful time. Could you imagine if Sony released an ad that was like wiping the floor, like a dirty floor with an Xbox One S or something? Or like they just like had loads of ads that was like game ass? You just couldn't do it. While nearly 400 games were made for the Game Gear over its lifespan, the system received middling third-party support where it really counted, leaving Sega responsible for most of its best games. That's a sizable list, including several very good Sonic the Hedgehog games, Defenders of Oasis, Ristar and Streets of Rage 2. Thanks to a comparatively high price point, it just wasn't enough to definitively overtake Nintendo's Game Boy, and the system was largely abandoned by Sega by the mid-90s. The Game Gear was a relative success for Sega, but it's tempting to wish Sega had done more with it. Like, I don't know, just spitballing here. Maybe revise it so you aren't buying a power plant's worth of batteries to keep playing James Pond every damn week. Number 5. Sega CD. While the Sega CD wasn't as bizarre a business decision as the 32X, the add-on nonetheless never quite found success with consumers. Released in Japan in 1991 and in North America in 1992, the system promised not only a slew of CD-based games, a media format quickly asserting itself as the future of the industry, with mind-boggling effects not that far away, but also enhanced support for certain cartridge-based games as well. Early reviews were good, but the system suffered in sales from both a high price tag and increasingly stiff competition from other companies getting into the home console market via CD technology. Yet, while the system didn't prove to be as successful as Sega might have hoped, there's a lot about this add-on to the Sega Genesis that's worth celebrating. Some truly good games were released for the system during its rocky run, including Luna, Silver Star Story, Snatcher for all you billionaires out there, Final Fight CD, Sonic CD, Lords of Thunder, and Popful Mail, Magical Fantasy Adventure. When looking through the catalogue of games released for the system, also known as the Sega Mega CD, it's another instance of being frustrated at what could have been. Within 2 years, it was an afterthought to many, and by the middle of the decade, it was just another add-on Sega abandoned for the next big thing. The Sega CD, in hindsight, did deserve a lot better. But we can't say that it was any better than, number 4, the Master System. The first Sega console that people generally remember, the Sega Master System waged war more directly against Nintendo. Personally speaking, one of my very earliest gaming memories is seeing the box for Super Tennis and just being wowed by just how shitty it looked. It's just a grid, you got a tennis ball, and you got a tennis racket. These days you'll just have some brooding protagonist with a back to camera looking all angry and moody, but back in those days, just a racket and a nice white background will do it. Unfortunately though, for the Master System, by 1985 Nintendo was largely in control of the market, leaving the home console to struggle in Japan, North America, and elsewhere. The system at least performed well enough that Sega continued the fight with the Genesis by the end of the 80s. Even if it struggled against Nintendo, the Sega Master System would prove to be a more than respectable 8-bit system, but we're not quite in the range of true brilliance for Sega just yet. The Master System may not have surpassed Nintendo, but they did outsell Atari, and through a poor marketing agreement with Tonka, managed to move enough consoles to justify trying again. The Sega Master System saw some truly great games, including Alex Kidd in Miracle World, a pair of whipper Disney platformers with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, the original Phantasy Star, and a surprisingly fun Sonic the Hedgehog released at the end of the console's life. It's a shame the console didn't get a little more attention, as it certainly had the games, though some games understandably feel a little bit aged these days. There's a fascinating piece of Sega history to be enjoyed with the Master System, which was technically more powerful under the hood than the NES, and also received a cheaper iteration, the Mark II, in its later years. However, Sega would need a stronger, more aggressive identity to become a serious threat to Nintendo's dominance. What's your favourite slightly shitty Sega Master System game cover? Be sure to let us know down below. Number 3, the Saturn. It's hard not to shed a tear for the Saturn, Sega's true effort at a successful 32-bit home console. While the console was another failure for Sega in the West, it was indeed quite popular with Japanese players. The Saturn even outsold the N64 in Japan, but with a system that was once again difficult to program for, and the dizzying momentum the Sony PlayStation was building up, the system never really hit its full potential. For North American gamers alone, the fact that the overwhelming majority of Sega Saturn releases were exclusive to Japan didn't help a market still trying to make sense of the 32X. The Sega Saturn deserved better than mismanagement and many other woes, because man, does this thing have some bangers. When you talk about the best games for the Sega Saturn, you're also talking about some of the best games in the history of Sega's entire run with home consoles. Even if you cut out the games that never left Japan, and there's several classics in that category alone, you're left with Nights into Dreams, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Shining Force 3, Virtua Fighter 2, Burning Rangers, and many more. Be sure to watch our video on the best Sega Saturn games in the link above, or on the right or on the left. Where is it these days? It's there somewhere, right? I'm gonna go right. Don't let sales fool you into thinking this isn't one of the best consoles of the 90s. The Sega Saturn didn't fail because of lousy games or a poorly designed system. It failed because Sega tried to do too much too often and literally kept shooting for the stars instead of aiming for consistency. Number 2, the Dreamcast. Is the Dreamcast the most underrated console of all time? We'd say so. While the GameCube has become the hipster pick, it doesn't have Seaman. That's one final victory in the console wars for Sega. Sega's last major console is a tragic story indeed. Seeming to fire on all cylinders for the first time in a long time, the Sega Dreamcast was Sega's entry into the 6th generation of video game consoles. In fact, it was the first of that generation, beating the Xbox, PlayStation 2 and GameCube to market. Launch games included strong titles like Sonic Adventure and Ready to Rumble Boxing, with several promising games on the way shortly after that. Blue Stinger also came out, which was more like Blue Stinker, eh? It wasn't that bad really, it was fine. Sega marketed the system aggressively, and fans and critics alike seem to agree that Sega was in its best form in years. The Dreamcast was a 128-bit marvel that promised to revolutionise the way you played video games. While it was a fantastic system across the board, Sony's dominance with the PS1 and soon the PS2 was simply just too great. It just didn't really matter how good the Dreamcast actually was at the end of the day. It also didn't help that Sega's new console was extremely expensive at the time, with third-party developers complaining early on that it was a pain to make games for it. By the time the PS2 was released by Sony and the Xbox came along from newcomer Microsoft on top of the Nintendo GameCube, which itself didn't do too great, there just wasn't any more attention to go around. Take a look at this image and tell me it doesn't feel like having most of the Dragon Balls in one beautiful place. The Dreamcast is still a brilliant effort by Sega and features some of the most influential games ever made, including Shenmue and its sequel, Skies of Arcadia, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio and Power Stone to name just a few, even if the system was done for in just a couple of years, and it really is just kind of admirable how much they put out in such a short space of time. Sega truly went out swinging with the Dreamcast, and they should always deserve some respect for that alone. Long live the Dreamcast. Number 1. Sega Genesis. The Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive outside of the United States, hello governor, put Nintendo on notice, even helping Sega to briefly surpass their rivals. The system gave us the now legendary Sonic the Hedgehog and a host of other iconic Sega characters. And also Awesome Possum. Can't win them all, guys, can't win them all. It was in every possible way a formidable home video game system for the time, but it was also an uphill battle for not only the Genesis, which was not the first 16-bit system released, that was the PC Engine from NEC, but for Sega as a whole. Released in Japan in 1998 and in US markets by 1989, it wouldn't get to Europe and elsewhere until a little after that. The system made a strong impression on US gamers quickly. While the system did well for itself in its home country, the Genesis would prove to be the wedge Sega needed to get their foot in the door with North American consumers, which was ultimately where the company saw their greatest potential success. Sega positioned the Genesis as a cooler and edgier alternative to the family-friendly fare of Nintendo by, well, basically bullying Nintendo in public, and for a time, it worked beautifully. The Sega Genesis saw dozens of good to great games released in its lifetime. Several of those, including Sonic the Hedgehog, the Streets of Rage series, Phantasy Star 4, Incredible Street Fighter 2, and Mortal Kombat ports and Shinobi 3, among many others, are considered to be some of the best 16-bit games ever made, and hold up pretty masterfully well today. We'd even argue that Genesis games perhaps hold up even better than most of what's on the SNES. The Genesis would be the one time Sega could line up their formidable console effort with a massive audience. That alone should make it the best console that Sega ever released, but the game's aesthetic and impact on the previously one company market makes the Genesis truly iconic and one of the best consoles of all time. And that was our list ranking every Sega console, or the Nintendo as your mum likes to call it, from worst to best. What was too high, what was too low? Be sure to let us know down your comments. Drink your comments, down them all, get them in your mouth. Down below, put your comments in the comments hall. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and thank you for watching.